Welcome back, you filthy exiles, and we have had a pretty crazy week with Path of Exile 1. Now, I thought I'd do a bit of a recap video covering off on all the things that have happened in the last 7 days, considering that League launch was last Saturday, and now it's the next Saturday. Go figure. Anyway, so I thought we'd go through some of the player number things, my interpretation around the player numbers, and the impact it's had on Path of Exile 2. We'll go through a quick breakdown of the meta, my thoughts on Mercenaries as well. I think unanimously it's a fantastic mechanic, but we'll talk about that in a bit more detail now that we've had time to mull over things, and they've also hotfixed this now. And then beyond that point, also, there was some server issues during the week we'll quickly catch off. And then finally, we'll go through some key uniques you should be looking out for, because the meta around uniques is totally different this league than what it's been before. And funnily enough, one of them is one of my favorite uniques to farm, because minions are more or less back, and that's fantastic. I'm actually running a second build as a minion build as we speak. But yeah, anyway, let's get into the video and look at the state of Path of Exile 1 3.26 for week 1. Okay, so player numbers wise for Path of Exile 1, it's not been the biggest league it's ever seen. So at 178.4 thousand peak players, at least on the Steam client that we're aware of, still a very, very significant player base. And in fact, it's not a bad player base in the totality of Path of Exile's leagues into the past, and we'll have a look at that in a moment. Interestingly enough, we're still looking at, a 24-hour peak of 113,000 people 1 week later, which isn't bad retention at all after 7 days. Like, the player count is always expected to go down, so this is totally reasonable. And at any one point in time, we're looking at 68,000 players, which is pretty damn good. Like, overall, that's a very strong player count, and we can see that in the amount of people that are streaming and everything else. Twitch is still going very strong. And yeah, overall, like, this is a successful league by any means, and Path of Exile once really indicated that even though there's been the delay for the last almost 12 months, as well as the inclusion of Path of Exile 2 with the strategy they're going with 2 months on, 2 months off for either game, is actually really good. And I'll talk about the intercorrelation between Path of Exile 1 and 2 player bases very shortly, which is something that I suspected would always end up happening as an inevitability. So looking back at the player trend going back to April 2023, we can clearly see at the most recent point is 178.4 thousand players, as mentioned. That's what we currently experienced in the first initial uptick on day 1 of the league. Now, the last league that we saw was 228,000 players, which was arguably a much bigger league. And obviously, it was also off the back of a more consistent league release cycle. However, what we can also see is if we look at March 2024, we were looking at 187,000, in December 2023, 167,000, and August 2023, 165,000, with April 2023 being 209,000. 178,000 is actually a very, like, slap bang in the middle of the mark sort of metric and number of players, at least from the Steam clients. And obviously we don't have the data from the off Steam client or standalone client, but this is a very strong league, and there is a very clear correlation that there is a very, very strong player base that is keen for this game. And it's definitely an indicator that in no way, shape, or form should we ever expect, at least in the foreseeable future, that GGG will ever give up on Path of Exile 1. Because number one, 178,000 people and a good chunk of that paying for supporter packs and whatnot would make up a huge sum total of the revenue stream for GGG. And also, 178,000 players is not a small player base. Even if you compare that to, 400 to 500,000 players, which is like the peaked numbers for Path of Exile 2, at least for the Steam client, that's still a very big player base, considering that Path of Exile 1's an 11-plus-year-old game, and it's come out this strong from the gate after almost a 12-month hiatus. That's a really good sign of things to come, and hopefully all they continue to do is bolster the game and improve it further, and we may be looking at another World of Warcraft scenario. But there's absolutely no indicator that I can see from a trend analysis standpoint that there is a drop-off in the player base and that the game is dying. Factually, there's no evidence to prove that at this stage based on the numbers that you're looking at in front of you. Now, interestingly, obviously, when we talk about player numbers for Path of Exile 1, we sort of have to look at player numbers for Path of Exile 2, and they're down to about 16.2 thousand. This is pretty much the player base numbers of when a league hits end of league for Path of Exile 1. Sometimes it sits about 10 to 12,000, something of that nature. Still a lot of players, fantastically large amount of players, either way you shake it. The reason for this, I surmise, and I don't know if this is actually the correct assumption to make here, but the player base between Path of Exile 1 and 2 is muchly the similar player base. So while you still have greater numbers in Path of Exile 2 for league launches and stuff like that, because it does attract that different market that is after a game like Path of Exile 2, it still attracts a huge chunk of the PoE 1 player base. In fact, a pretty predominant amount of the player base, to be honest with you. And that's a good thing. That means that at the worst case scenario on a two month release cycle, then the base player base is always going to be the standard hardcore. And when I say hardcore, I mean like the PoE dedicated players over the general market outside of that. So that's a good sign that PoE 2 will have that propping up from between the two games. And really, it's just going to be when you drop off on Path of Exile 1, because the league is going a bit stale after 2 months, then you can go to Path of Exile 2 and play the new league and vice versa. And I think this is a really good way for them to manage the release schedule for Path of Exile as an overall. It means that we get constant content. So you go from one game when it goes a bit stale to the next game and just springboard between the two. And if they can keep this up, I think this is great. But this is what I read from the indicative numbers that we're getting from just the Steam client for Path of Exile 2. This isn't saying that PoE 2 is a dying game. That would be a silly comment to make at this stage. It's an early access. This just means it's just not the flavor of the month right now, and everybody's moved over to Path of Exile 1. Now, I don't know what the numbers will look like when Path of Exile 2 drops in totality, but it'll be interesting to see where we go to with that. But it's a very interesting thing to look at, because there is definitely a correlation between the player numbers between PoE 1 and 2, as well as the residual numbers that we have after an initial league launch, because generally people come in, play the flavor of the month game, go play Elden Ring or whatever. But the PoE players tend to be very hardcore and dedicated to the PoE grind at the end of the day, and those are the players that will stick with the game for the longest amount of time. That being said, is a new element of those players that have been created with Path of Exile 2 as well, and you'll probably find that those players will also cycle between Path of Exile 2 to Path of Exile 1 on a regular basis as well, which actually increases the PoE 1 player base over time as well. So PoE 1 and 2 are symbiotic of one another at the end of the day, and they can only benefit each other and not detriment each other from the way that I read these numbers. Okay, so with a new league comes new metas, and definitely I did not expect to see Zerka number 1, but this makes a lot of sense. So looking at the Zerka breakdown from poe.ninja, what we can basically see is that in the number 1 pole position is the Zerka, and in particular 86% of the Zerka player base is playing Volcanic Fissure of Snaking, and the reason being is this is like super high damage and super easy no brain mode, gets reasonably defensive, and yeah, it's just an overall really solid build. It's also not overly expensive to be able to gear up at the early level, and it has a really good progression curve as well. Obviously, when you're taking it further into endgame, there's a bit of investment that you have to put into every single build, but as an overall, this isn't a bad thing to see. It's good to see Zerka in such a strong position, because it hasn't really been there for a very long time. The next one, which is number 2, is the Elementalist. Now, obviously, the Elementalist got a huge buff this league across all of its ascendancy points, so it's much more potent than it ever was before. At this stage, about 20% of the player base is playing Explosive Arrow Ballista Totems. I'm not surprised by this. Like, this is just drop totem, let it do a ton of damage, and walk away and rinse and repeat. I personally have never been the biggest fan of EA Ballista Totems, because it's not really my playstyle, because I like playing tanks and stuff like that. You can get it somewhat tanky, but it is definitely a really good build at the end of the day. So, you know, if you're looking for a Elementalist meta that's out there, this is definitely one to look at. But yeah, this is the number 2 position on the ladder right now. Number 3 is Smite of Divine Judgment on the Slayer, funnily enough. I didn't actually expect this, and this makes a lot of sense considering things like Lightning Strike got nerfed in the 3.26 patch notes. So obviously people are going into another direction with that. It's also really interesting to see that Cyclone is being played at 12% of the player base, which is surprising. And obviously General's Cry is also being played a lot. Obviously Flicker Strike on the Slayer is being played with like Ricardas and stuff like that. But yeah, overall, the Slayer's got some really interesting dynamic builds going on this league, as opposed to just like Flicker Strike and Lightning Strike. Basically, we're seeing a lot different of a play set on this. And obviously, also with Mercenaries, this totally changes the way that we gear up builds, and we can get extra power into builds and stuff like that that otherwise really struggled. I actually think Mercs have been fantastic in creating build enabling options for skills that were previously not really thought about. And this is really good to see that Slayer's number 3 on the most played list right now. Number 4 on the list is not surprising, and it's the Necromancer. And this is giving me like vibes from a league past gone. Necromancers were once one of the most played classes in the entire game, and they've sort of found their way back up to a really good position again. Like things like the Crown of the Tyrant now are selling for like up to 40 div and things like that out of Crystal King drops. And that's because these builds are just absolutely nuts. Like I'm actually building my own minion build, which is my Phantasm Soul Rest build. And I found there was just like a ton of different ways that we can make that totally ridiculously tanky now. And the build just feels amazing to level up with SRS. Like it's such a clean build. But at the moment, 30% of the player base is playing Bammer. And that's not surprising because Bammer is incredibly strong. And yeah, basically, it's sort of good to see. Like, I like that Necromancers are getting powerful again, and you can have like a whole Army of Darkness thing with like Reanimator Mercenaries and stuff like that. I really think minions are in a good place, or moving towards a really good place again. So that's really good to see. Yeah. And number 5 on the list, funnily enough, is RF Chieftain. And it's actually, I'll be honest with you, even though Fire Trap got nerfed, it's really good to see this build in, the top 5 position right now. So 63% of all chieftains are playing Righteous Fire, with 37% playing Fire Trap, even though it's been nerfed. Why do people play Righteous Fire? Because it works. Like the other thing too is like you can now like negative res yeah, negative res reduce enemies using Crown of the Tyrant on your Mercenary. You can also use the Mercenary to give you a ton of extra buffs to make your build stronger or tankier or whatever it might be, or to assist you in dealing damage. It's just really good to see that RF is still up there. It is definitely one of the more approachable builds for new players because it doesn't have any of that complexity. Like it has complexity, but it doesn't have some of the complexity that you have to go through to spec up and build and balance other builds. It sort of just natively scales up, and you don't have to worry about dying as much. So as an overall, I like seeing RF in the top 5 as a meta to this day. Like obviously, if you're looking for build guides on this, go to Pox's channel. Pretty much this is his thing. But yeah, no, this is really good to see as an overall. So obviously another big issue that was encountered during the week was due to server stability. So people in particular in the EU servers were dropping out quite a lot. There were like rolled back of loot drops and or busted maps, things like that. It was just driving people a bit insane for most of the week. Also console players sort of lost out because the PS4 and or the PlayStation and the Xbox client wasn't able to be initiated until a day after the league launch, which isn't necessarily great. Basically, they address this in a post that was put out earlier in the week, and I'll put a link to it in the description. But they go into saying, with the elephant in the room, unfortunately, their European servers across and also other servers across the globe had been facing a barrage of DDoS attacks. They understand that the issue has ruined such an anticipated launch for many players. This is unacceptable service, and they're deeply sorry. Like they have to say that, obviously. We want to ensure you that we're taking this very seriously, and it is the highest priority problem for the company to solve. Due to the nature of these attacks, they're unable to provide a timeline of when it will be resolved, but they do acknowledge that they see the issue and they're doing everything they can mitigate it. I understand this position from the right. Like, this isn't something that is like busted with their tech at the end of the day, right? This is people attacking their servers at the end of the day and making it incredibly difficult for them to deal with that. The problem that exists with this is just why do this, like in the first place, and ruin everybody's experience. And there's definitely a cluster of people out there that just get off on this sort of stuff. And why they would target like Path of Exile in particular is absolutely bizarre. Like it's just unnecessary and it's childish at the end of the day. But unfortunately, like, yep, it's not ideal, and definitely GGG needs to invest in better countermeasures to deal with this. But in the other side of things, it's not like something that they've deliberately done to impact the player base. It's they're trying to beat off, you know, a bunch of people trying to damage their reputation and whatnot for whatever reasons they might have. I don't know. But it's just disappointing to see that this is the behavior of people in this day and age that still just want to do this sort of stuff and ruin the fun for everybody at the end of the day. Hopefully GGG figures this out, and I'm sure they will. You know, this isn't uncommon to what many other gaming companies have done out there. It's just disappointing that, you know, they're even put into that position in the first place, because there's just no need for that to happen. So, you know, understandably people are upset about that, but just bear in mind, like, you know, this is something that GGG is trying to resolve, but it's not an issue that they created, you know, in isolation for themselves. It's an issue that they're having to deal with just for the case of existing, which really just isn't a fair thing. So I sort of look at this reasonably, and would say, like, as a network administrator, give them the benefit of the doubt and just be patient over this process. But they'll get there eventually, and eventually things will stabilize. The problem with it is if people are consistently attacking them, they'll continue to do that, and they'll find new routes and intakes to do that as well, which is really disappointing at the end of the day. So fingers crossed GGG can put in a preventative protocol to stop that moving forwards. So, of course, every league, there's a bunch of drops that come out, and this is based on various builds that exist that become so egregiously awesome and also profitable that, you know, we have to mention them in a list like this. So let's have a quick look at some of the things that are worth value in the first week, that just in case you do farm it or drop it, you have a bit of an idea of what it's actually worth. First on the cards is the Savior. Now, this sword drops from Uber Cyrus encounters, and for a very long time this one was really popular, in particular with things like Blade Flurry builds. So the big thing here is it triggers level 20 reflection when equipped. So if you were running like a Bleed Gladiator with Blade Flurry or General's Cry potentially, and maybe not General's Cry, but anyway, if you're running something that, you know, had any sort of like projectile skill or whatnot, or like channeled skill, it's actually a really strong item. This one is currently trading for about 30 divine on the market, so it is a very, very expensive unique, and unfortunately it only drops from the Uber version of Cyrus, which I only just found out earlier. And I was like, ah, damn, we could have just run lower level versions of Cyrus, but had that have been that easy, everybody would have been farming it and it wouldn't be worth 30 div, right? But yeah, if you do end up farming Uber Cyrus for whatever reason, definitely keep an eye out for this one. It does have value this league, despite it didn't have a lot of value in past leagues. The next one that's went up in value is the Savalan. So obviously this has built-in Lucky Block, which is absolutely fantastic. This was really affordable last league, obviously, because it was pretty easy to get the encounter through settlers or would come in through shipping. Shipping is now more expensive and less convenient than what it previously was, even though it still is really convenient. But there's also the ability to get this to drop from the Black Knight encounter as well, which spawns randomly in maps. So if you do run into this one's worth about 61 div plus. So this is a very expensive item. 3 of these drop for you. You can get yourself a Mage Blood at this stage, which is pretty cool. But keep your eyes out. This is definitely one that would be worth farming at the end of the day. The next one drops off the Uber encounter for Exarch. Now, I don't like Uber Exarch personally. It's not my favorite boss to farm, but there's definitely a player base out there that likes to absolutely nuke him with one hit, because it's difficult to play into the latter ends of the actual boss fight. The Celestial Vambra, or the Celestial Brace, is currently worth 54 divine. Now, the reason why it's worth this much is because of maximum fortification and increased attack speed per fortification. This obviously synergizes with the new Fortify Ascendancy nodes on the champion. So this is a very, very strong item to have on a champion. It's going to buff up your damage by significant sums and totals. So yeah, if you are farming Uber X Arcs or anything like that, or you see these for cheap, or somehow acquire these for cheap, or did acquire these for cheap, they're now worth 54 div. So yeah, just the more you know at the end of the day, right? So of all the items that I've shown so far, this one is actually the easiest to get, and it drops off the Crystal King. It's also one of the most expensive items out there too. This is the Crown of the Tyrant. So there's a very high probability that you'll either get an All's Uprising or a Crown of the Tyrant on any Crystal King encounter in Delve. Obviously, that fight is very, very hard. Now, especially the lower down you go. Now, the Kings will spawn from about 130 depth. I usually farm them at about 300 to 350, and I use a horizontal boss strategy. I'll have a guide coming out in the next week covering off on all the hints and tips that I use for farming low tier delve. And basically, yeah, there's a good probability one of these could drop. Usually they're reasonably common if you're farming a lot of delve, so the delve players tend to be the ones that sell these. Right now, as of checking it today, there are only like 3 or 4 of these on the market. They are really sought after for minion builds, and that's because nearby enemies have negative 10 to all resistances, and they only roll at one socket that you can recolor, and based on the recolor, that gives your allies base damage. So basically, you know, if you got fire damage for a red socket, so it increases your base fire damage, cold for a green, etc., etc. So if you do get one of these to drop, don't put it on the market for anything less than about 40 div right now. At the lowest, put it up for like 38 div. You'll make plenty of bank back, and a few of these drop with some good alls uprisings, and you'll be laughing. Now, the last one to keep an eye out for is Yinda's Stand. Now, this one spawns out of shipping from settlers, so if you're doing shipping for settlers, this one will come through. They're currently trading for about 14 div at the lowest point, and they go up from there, mainly because there seems to be some sort of ward stacking build that's coming out of this from this league, and so gains ward instead of 50% armor and evasion rating for equipped body armor. So there might be some sort of weird ward loop interaction going on again this league because of all the buffs and changes to the overall game and all the inclusions of the mercenaries and everything. So if you are doing shipping for settlers content, definitely keep an eye out for these if they come through. They were worthless last league, but they are certainly not worthless this league. So yeah, that'd be the 5th one that I'll mention on this list of things to keep an eye out for. Okay, so as an overall, like, just sort of recapping everything, I actually think this is maybe one of the best leagues that has ever been released in Path of Exile history. Not only just like the endgame pinnacles have been included, and they're not that hard, to be honest with you. I was like face tanking them with my Sunder Chieftain. But like the overall like mercenaries mechanic, I think was long awaited and needed for Path of Exile. So a few notes I have is like the ease of the ability to like aura and curse stack now. Some of the mercs just have insane levels of damage, which is really cool because like you want them to do damage, right? So they're not like pushovers. The drops on the mercs as well, the gear they come with, they're freaking insane. Like some of the elemental, like some of that gear you just wouldn't roll normally and it just wouldn't drop. I think like the drop rates on them and some of the stuff is very usable for endgame builds and everything. The mercs for the most are very durable as well. Like they don't instantly fall over, and like there is a bit of gearing on them to get them to work the way that you want them to work, depending on what you're doing with them. But they're not pushovers, which is good to see. Obviously, people were stacking a lot of Doriani's prototype, and that was because it's just super powerful, stacking negative resistance. I don't know if that's now been nerfed a bit because it was quite out of control. But if it's not, definitely take advantage of it. It's probably going to get nerfed next league. Overall, yeah, as I noted, the better global drops is a good inclusion. So obviously, the overall game difficulty has been made harder by having the mercs. So you have the party bonus, right? So there is that element that the game is harder, but there is also the element that as an overall, you're getting better drops out of this. So I feel like there's a really good compromise where we're getting more and better loot and better drops as an overall natively. And then the game difficulty is harder because of that. I think I'm okay with that. And I think like the strength that the mercs actually have is a good counterbalance and counterplay to that, to be honest with you. And, you know, I don't know how people would take this comment. I actually think the mercs would be needed for Path of Exile 2 to feel a hell of a lot better. Like, if PoE 2 has the mercs in it, I feel like that's something that's currently really missing with Path of Exile 2 from a player satisfaction level. And hopefully they sort of look at PoE 1, they go, actually, yeah, we're going to put that in PoE 2. I would definitely jump on board with that. I think that's great. And I think the inclusion of mercs is fantastic in Path of Exile 1. And this brings me to the final comment I'll make about mercs, which is I don't think they should be nerfed as far as their difficulty. I actually don't mind dying to a merc. And, you know, that's a wild thing that I would say, being a tank player, and when you get one hit or something like that. I think the fact that the mercs are challenging is a good thing. Like, those mercs hit like trucks, but it's fun because it's like, oh, I'm going to throw down with you, like, come on. And then the next one you see, like, I'm going to do you in. And, like, there's obviously, like, the rewards that come with that. Some builds can just cheese them because they're ridiculous, but that's more the, like, that's the outlier and not the average norm of builds out there. But I overall think the Mercs should be sufficiently powerful to be able to utilize that power. You should have to earn that. And I like the challenge that the Mercs actually give to the player. I just really like the Mercs. I really hope they go core, or in some form go core to the level that they are now. I think they're fantastic fun. Definitely makes leveling up in the early game a lot more fun, a lot more. I think it answers like a lot of questions and issues that players have had with the game for a very long time. Personally, I think Merc League's fantastic. I know not everybody will agree with that, but as an overall, I think Mercs really make, like, it's basically like a whole new Path of Exile with Mercs, right? I want to see more content like Mercs content, because I think that was a really, really good inclusion in the game and should have probably been added to the game many, many years ago. But yeah, as an overall, I love the Mercs mechanic. So that's my final thoughts on that. Anyway, hopefully this video gave you some interesting information. So if that's the case, don't forget to like and sub to the channel. Don't forget to follow the Twitch. And drop a comment below. And feel free to tell us all how you're feeling about the league. And yeah, just keep it respectful and whatnot as normal. Anyway, until next time, I'll see you guys later on, and have a good one.